All right, and welcome to the second part of today's lecture, which is going to lead us into the second or the radical phase of the revolution. So the French Revolution traditionally is seen in three phases. The first phase is the liberal phase, which is the breakdown of the old regime and the establishment of the first constitution, which creates a constitutional monarchy as the government, and it also is when the wars begin with the rest of Europe. But when war breaks out, that really initiates the second or the more radical phase of the French Revolution. And this is the phase that is famous for the violence, the chaos, the reign of terror, the guillotine, and all of that. So, a major player in the radical revolution is a group that we call the Sans-Culottes. And we actually have already met the Sans-Culottes. They are the urban workers in Paris. But this term, the Sans-Culottes, is used to describe them, especially during the more radical phases of the revolution, as the Sans-Culottes were seen as an extremely radical, violent mob, angry mob, basically. And their violence and their influence ultimately kept the revolution moving forward. So they had been responsible for many of the big moments. They had been responsible for the storming of the Bastille, the March to Versailles, the Women's March to Versailles, and all the other major events we'll see in the radical phase, like the September massacres and things like that. The Sans-Culottes began to sort of adopt a certain identity, and you might even say uniform. They wore what was called the Phrygian cap, which you can see right here, this guy's little red cap that he's wearing. And this little red cap was a symbol for freedom. And this actually was a hat that was worn during the Roman Republic, like back in antiquity. The Sans-Culottes, and they also wore generally red, white, and blue, like the stripy red pants and the blue sash. Were really common with the sort of sans-culotte identity. And you can see both a man and a woman dressed in that sort of sans-culotte style. The term sans-culotte, I'd also like to explain, basically means like without pants, but refers to a specific type of pants, the culottes, which were like these fancy sort of pants, like poofy pants that the aristocrats wore. And of course, urban workers in Paris couldn't afford those type of fancy pants. They wore like normal pants, like we wear today. And so the fact that they, wore normal pants, that became sort of like a chip on their shoulder. So they called themselves the Sans-Culottes, which is sort of a funny name. It's not like they were all like running around in their underwear, having these angry mobs and things like that. No, they definitely wore pants. Anyways, the Sans-Culottes were mostly led by a man named Georges Danton. We'll learn about Georges Danton here in a moment. You can see his name right here, right? Georges Danton. He was a member of the bourgeoisie who was also very involved in the leadership of the revolution, had been so since the beginning. Recently, he had been appointed the new Minister of Justice, and ultimately became kind of a leader and a representative of the Sans-Culottes in the actual French government. Now, the Sans-Culottes are not part of of the government. They are a separate faction, right? They will put a lot of pressure on the French government, but ultimately the Sans-Culottes have their own economic agenda and their own goals, and they tend to be seen as very radical. For example, they wanted to have more price controls on bread and other consumer goods. They also favored direct democracy. So they wanted to see like universal suffrage, every man having the right to vote in direct democracy. And they had their own neighborhood clubs and assemblies as well. And if the French government did not meet their demands, or if they felt that the French government was too moderate, they would rise up in an angry mob and incite violence. All right, so in addition to the Sans-Culottes, the second or more radical phase of the revolution also will introduce us to some of the leading men of the revolution. Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, and Jean-Paul Marat, all of whom play a very important role. And there's important men beyond this, but I think these are the three most important ones for the purpose of our lecture. So Maximilien Robespierre is really the most iconic figure who is associated with the French Revolution, beyond, of course, Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette. Robespierre was experienced as a lawyer, so he was a member of the bourgeoisie. He was a lawyer. Before the revolution, he had spent a lot of time representing the poor and was sort of quite charitable with his legal work. He's also known for his altruism and his passion. So he was sometimes described as like the uncorruptible, and he was incredibly passionate about equality and justice, especially in the early days of the revolution. Robespierre was involved with the revolution from the very beginning. He was elected as a delegate for the Third Estate at the convening of the Estates General, and eventually he became a leader in the Jacobin political club. So we associate both Robespierre and Danton with the Jacobins. Robespierre was known to be a really enigmatic, charismatic public speaker, right? So he was a great orator. But this also makes him a very divisive figure during the revolution. He will ascend to power throughout the revolution, and this second or radical phase of the revolution is when he ultimately comes to dominate the French government. And ultimately, he's going to become consumed with his own lust for power, and in doing so, creates his own dictatorship during the Reign of Terror. So he essentially kind of is corrupted by the French Revolution, but he's still, I think, a fascinating character, Robespierre. Now, Georges Danton, he was basically besties with Robespierre most of the time. Danton had also had a legal background, was also a member of the bourgeoisie, and represented the Third Estate. And he is going to be a leading advocate for overthrowing the monarchy and ending and establishing what becomes the First French Republic. And like I said, Georges Danton is also a voice for the sans-culottes of Paris. And sometimes he will be the leader of what we call the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune essentially becomes the local government of Paris, independent of the national government. We'll talk about that more later. And you guys might remember a little bit about Jean-Paul Marat. Jean-Paul Marat was also a member of the sort of bourgeoisie Third Estate group. But he had been a physician, he had been a doctor, but he had fallen on hard times and was homeless and developed a skin infection, but he was really more of a journalist. He was not so much a politician who participated in the government like Robespierre and Danton. Marat was really more of the journalist, and a really fanatical journalist. We call them pamphleteers. And he had a pamphlet, essentially think of it like as a newspaper he published, and ironically it was called The Friend of the People. But he was largely responsible for creating the rumors and inciting a lot of the violence for some of the more dramatic moments of the revolution, like the Women's March to Versailles. Marat, like Danton and Robespierre, was a staunch defender of the sans-culottes, of the urban poor, and really felt that he spoke for them. And he was also he was cherished by the sans-culottes as well. That's why when he is eventually assassinated, it is such a traumatizing moment for the revolutionary leaders. More on that later. Okay, and moving on to the continuation of events in the French Revolution. I paused there briefly to explain a couple of key players, especially get into the second phase, but let's get back to the timeline. In July of 1792, Prussia and Austria issued something called the Brunswick Manifesto. And essentially, the Brunswick Manifesto was similar to the Declaration of Pillnitz. It's a threat against France. But specifically, Prussia and Austria threatened to destroy Paris if the royal family was harmed at all. And this was specifically in response to a series of Jacobin-incited mobs that had recently seized power in Paris. So Robespierre, Danton, and Marat had actually been encouraging the sans-culottes to seize power and push the revolution forward, because Robespierre and Danton in particular had their own political agenda. They wanted to get rid of the monarchy entirely and establish a republic. We will see that this becomes more and more clear here in a moment. But still, Prussia and Austria, in response to this increasing violence, said that if anything happened to the royal family, they would destroy Paris. Well, if you remember how France responded to the Declaration of Pillnitz, you can likely assume that there will be a similar reaction to the Brunswick Manifesto. France is not going to be intimidated by this. They're not going to back down on it. In fact, just a few weeks later, in August of 1792, the angry Parisian mob will attack Tuileries Palace, which was the royal residence of the king and queen and their children. So again, stoked by rumors and fear and anger, hundreds, if not thousands, of the sans-culottes stormed Tuileries Palace in an attempt to get at the royal family. The reasons don't really matter. It's just another, it's another day where they're targeting the royal family. The king and queen had to flee their Tuileries Palace there, and ran to the Legislative Assembly, which was meeting for protection. And so the Legislative Assembly basically immediately suspended the monarchy as an institution and imprisoned the royal family for their own safety. But still, like, many guards were killed as the sans-culotte mob had tried to attack the palace, and the royal family barely escaped for their lives. So now we're starting to see what the influence of what we call the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune is essentially the city government of Paris, the revolutionary city government of Paris, like the local government. And it essentially usurped, meaning it undermined the power of the Legislative Assembly. The Paris Commune, again, think of it as like the local government of Paris. That undermines the national government. It was led by George Danton, and down here we have, just so you know, Danton on the far left, Robespierre in the middle, and Marat on the right. That's what these guys looked at. So Danton was the leader of the Paris Commune, and the Paris Commune, which of course represented the sans-culottes and the more radical ideas of the working poor and the Jacobins, wanted to push for a republic. So at the urging of these radicals, the Legislative Assembly ultimately suspended the Constitution of 1791, right? So they're going to table their first Constitution and decide, they need to develop a new, better Constitution, because clearly France is not satisfied with this first Constitution of 1791. So the Legislative Assembly then ordered new elections for a new government based on universal male suffrage. Now, this is significant because this is probably the first time in modern European history that we see universal male suffrage implemented in any capacity. And the idea is that they would have universal male suffrage so every man could vote regardless of their social class or their property qualifications. And this would lead to the creation of a new national convention and give France a republican form of government. Right, but things are, in general, really crazy by fall of 1792. Again, there's lots of pressures from the radicals, from the sans-culottes. Robespierre and Danton, leaders of the Jacobins, are trying to push for a republican government. There's a counter-revolutionary movement going on. There's a war going on. So things are tense. They are chaotic. And so that's also why we see the event known as the September Massacres in September of 1792. This began when rumors started to spread that the prisoners, specifically aristocrats and priests associated with the counter-revolution, the rumors said that these prisoners were actually plotting with foreign invaders and planned to join up with the approaching Prussian army. Prussia had recently actually invaded eastern France and increased more popular hysteria, because that's exactly what France needed at the moment. So these rumors start circulating. The prisoners are going to break out. They're going to join the Prussians and overthrow the revolution. So in response, thousands of people come together in an angry Parisian mob and break into the prisons, and they slaughter the prisoners. They kill priests and former nobles, members of the bourgeoisie, anyone who was perceived to oppose their radical program. And this is actually one of the most shocking moments of violence in the revolution, at least before we get to the Reign of Terror, because it simply was the result of rumors, and many, frankly, quite innocent people were pulled out of their prisons and slaughtered by the mob. And this was really shocking to many foreign supporters of the revolution as well. Not long after that, on September 21st of 1792, France is formally declared a republic. The monarchy is abolished, and it is replaced by a republican form of government. So that means no monarchy. For example, here in the United States, we have what is called a republican form of government, and it has nothing to do with the idea of a political party, right? The Legislative Assembly now became known as the National Convention. So we went from National Assembly to Legislative Assembly. Now we are at the National Convention. And this new National Convention is still a legislature, but it is now dominated by Jacobins and Republicans, who are also well-educated members of the middle class, members of the bourgeoisie. And they were elected by universal male suffrage, as we saw, and this was the first time in European history there's true universal male suffrage in the government, in any government. And this new constitution, this new government, was supposedly rooted in the ideas of égalité, liberté, fraternité, equality, liberty, and fraternity, which means brotherhood. And that really is like the rallying cry of the French Revolution, égalité, liberté, fraternité. But even though the Jacobins had succeeded in establishing a republican government, factions still began to emerge in this new national convention. And two of the most famous factions really are what we call the Mountain and the Girondins. The Mountain came to represent the most radical Republicans, those who represented the urban workers of Paris. The leaders included Danton and Robespierre. They were members of this group, and they got the name the Mountain because this group of men sat on the uppermost left-hand benches of the assembly hall. So they sat like at the very top, so it looked like they were sitting up on the mountain. The other faction that begins to emerge was known as the Girondins. The Girondins became the more moderate faction, and they did not necessarily come from and represent the urban class. They predominantly represented the more rural interests of France, which tended to be more moderate. So, for example, the Girondins did not support the execution of the king, which the Mountain did. And the Girondins wanted to focus on other things like economic liberalism and fighting the war, and focus less on targeting these perceived enemies of the revolution, which, as we will see, is a main agenda for the Mountain and people like Robespierre and Danton. Don't forget that throughout all this, France is, of course, fighting a war with against most of the rest of Europe, and this war is starting to expand. The French Revolutionary Army actually started to win battles against Prussia and Austria, and this increased the morale of the country, right? So this justified the war effort, and it also seemed to confirm the leadership and the transition to a republic. And in February of 1793, the following year, the National Convention decided to expand the war, and they declared war on Britain and Holland and Spain, in addition to continuing the war with Austria and Prussia. And so that's why we really call this the War of the First Coalition, because it's France against this coalition of the rest of Europe, basically. And you will see that France actually wins. France actually does pretty well, but more on that later. Anyways, a major moment in the French Revolution, January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI is executed. This represents a major victory for the Mountain and for men like Robespierre and Danton. They really had pushed for the execution of the king. Louis had been accused of conspiring with Austria against the revolution, so he was seen as a traitor, right? And so the punishment for treason is, of course, execution. And so this represents the triumph of those very radical forces in the Republic now. However, those who voted for regicide, meaning those who voted for the execution of the king, now had to preserve the existing government, or they would lose their lives if Royalists were able to return to power, because there were still factions of Royalists that had supported the king. I mean, they weren't necessarily involved in the government at this point, but there were still supporters of the French monarchy. And one of the ways that the existing government, like, Robespierre and Danton, will justify this extremism, justify killing the king, justify maintaining their own power, is because of the war effort. They expanded the war, and with the expansion, of course, they're not going to win every battle, but they believe that the war effort against the rest of Europe justified their need for more centralization and more extremism. So keep in mind, the war is often used as a justification for this gravitation back to authoritarianism. Also, Robespierre and Danton and their friends began to become very concerned about their own power. And they began to adapt this ideology that if you're not with us, you're against us. And they began to see everyone as a potential enemy of the revolution, specifically their own political enemies in the government. And so in May of 1793, the Girondins were expelled from the National Convention. Again, the Mountain, these extreme Jacobists, led by Robespierre and Danton, and were also supported by the Sculottes, ultimately expelled the Girondins, their political rivals. The Mountain had believed that the Girondins would actually ally with conservatives and Royalists to retain power, and that they ultimately would overthrow the Republic, right? So they saw the Girondins as enemies to the state, even though they were just political enemies of the Jacobins. And so 31 Girondist members of the National Convention were arrested, and this ultimately left the Mountain in control. And the Mountain, throughout all this, is becoming, again, even more radical than some of the sans-culottes. At this point, the revolutionary government is starting to lose the confidence of much of France, especially outside of Paris. The expulsion of the Girondins was seen as unnecessary. You might say it was even seen as cannibalistic by many people in France. And so outside of Paris, we start to see more counter-revolutionary movements in trying to undermine the revolutionary leadership. And many Girondins that weren't arrested actually fled Paris and worked against the revolution in the counter-revolutionary movement. Now, Robespierre and Danton had believed, that there were enemies among us, and we needed to, and that France needed to increase its centralization and increase its extremism, because we never know when the enemy is going to strike. And ironically, their fears were justified with the assassination of Jean-Paul Marat. And I know we talked about this briefly when we were learning about neoclassicism, but this is, of course, a moment that deserves to be revisited. To the right on the screen, you can see Jacques-Louis David's famous painting, The Death of Marat. Marat, as we know, was a fanatical journalist in the revolution who was responsible for a lot of the rumors and mob violence and more extreme and violent moments of the revolution. And so naturally, he became a target of the counter-revolutionary movement. And so Marat would ultimately be stabbed to death in his bathtub by a woman named Charlotte Corday, who was a supporter of the Girondins and the counter-revolutionary movement. And he's assassinated. And of course, Charlotte Corday is arrested and executed in response. But also, Marat's assassination justified the extremism and centralization of the Republican government, and it justified this belief that there were enemies of the revolution, and it ultimately encouraged and furthered this atmosphere of fear and suspicion. And actually, this was one of the reasons why the Jacobins would close the women's political clubs, like the Society for Revolutionary Republican Women. That was closed in response to the death of Marat, because they thought, well, Charlotte Corday is a woman, she murdered Marat, we can't have women participating in politics. So they closed a lot of the women's clubs. All right, moving on. In summer of 1793, the Republican government decides to form what is called the Committee of Public Safety. The Committee of Public Safety was seen as an emergency government, all right? So it's sort of an emergency committee to deal with the internal and external challenges to the revolution. Again, this was something that was sort of encouraged by the death of Marat. And this was seen as necessary because this increased centralization was necessary to combat the enemies of the revolution. So the Committee of Public Safety was essentially an executive committee with broad powers, all right? So there were only 12 members in the executive committee, and it was led by Maximilien Robespierre. At this point, Robespierre was heavily influenced by the ideas of Rousseau, especially the idea of general will, and Robespierre also fanatically supported revolutionary idealism. He had enormous power at this point, all right? So think of the Committee of Public Safety more as declaring like a state of emergency, where the traditional Republican government does not have its normal power, and instead we have this special committee of 12 men led by Robespierre, and they have an exceptional amount of power, all right? This is not what the Republican government intended to look like, but that's what happened. And again, this was justified because of these perceived internal and external challenges. The internal challenge of the Civil War against the counter-revolution, and the external challenge, which was war against other European states. And as the leader of the Committee of Public Safety, Robespierre increasingly used his power to exercise his own personal vendettas against counter-revolutionaries, against political enemies, including people who accused him of dictatorship. All right, so people would accuse him of being a dictator, and then he would act like a dictator and have them executed. The Committee of Public Safety also closely collaborated with the Sculottes. The Sculottes encouraged actually a lot of this violence and this centralization because they believed it benefited them, although some Sculottes were victims of the Reign of Terror. And the Committee of Public Safety enacted sort of, the state of emergency, like I said. They limited the rights of the accused. They created new special courts to try people, and because many people would be accused. And this would create an environment where essentially an accusation of treason, saying that this person is an enemy of the revolution, accusation basically led to execution. And this is what initiated the Reign of Terror, which we will talk about more in just a moment. At the same time, in order to deal with the War of the First Coalition, the French government is going to initiate something called the levée en masse. Military victories in the War of the First Coalition had led to the desire to spread revolutionary ideals outside France. And so France reorganized its army, actually, and expanded the size of the army. The government believed that universal mobilization was necessary to combat this coalition of Austria, Prussia, Spain, Portugal, Britain, and the Dutch, all against France. And so in some ways, the entire nation was conscripted into service as the war became defined as this national mission. All right, so that means all the economic activity was geared towards the war effort. And this is also, like I said, what really justifies this atmosphere of fear and suspicion. More specifically, however, this led to mass conscription, like a draft. So the government established that all able-bodied unmarried men between the ages of 18 and 25 were conscripted to serve. So all young men in France basically were conscripted to serve in the army. And by September of 1794, this meant that there were over 1 million troops in the French army, and this is an unprecedented size. We have never seen an army this large in modern European history. So the French now outnumbered their enemies 4-1. So even though they're fighting Austria, Prussia, Spain, Portugal, Britain, and the Dutch, their army is still 4 times bigger. They even win some notable battles. They gain some territory. France was able to regain the Austrian Netherlands, which is modern-day Belgium. They claimed parts of the Rhineland in modern-day Germany. They were winning against the First Coalition, which was essentially falling apart. And like I said, there will be a planned economy, a government-controlled economy to support this universal mobilization. That's called the Law of the General Maximum, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But what's really important here is this demonstrates the emergence of French nationalism. Nationalism truly becomes a unifying force for many people in France. This idea that France, this is a people's government fighting a people's war. So this really helps the development of what we consider to be modern nationalism. Now, of course, not everyone is supportive of the Republican government, but most people in France are supportive of not being invaded and conquered by outside powers. However, as the war expands to become larger and larger, this does mean that civilians are killed on a larger scale than ever before, and the door is opened to what ultimately becomes the total war of the modern world. So this is one of the first really expansive modern wars. Kind of a precursor to the brutal wars of the 20th century. And while military victories led to some relaxation of emergency controls, the reign of terror was actually extended. And talk about that more in a moment. But first I want to talk more about the Law of the General Maximum, because this tells us about the sort of economics of the French government during this very radical phase of the revolution. So Robespierre, who for all intents and purposes is the leader of France at this point, wanted a planned economy in response to food shortages, the war effort, and other economic problems. So a planned economy basically means like a total government-controlled economy. No economic liberalism here. This planned economy would enable France to wage total war against its external enemies and support the war effort. So what this means is there will be price controls, all right? So the government set a maximum allowable price on key products like food, specifically bread, other consumer products. Of course, the price of bread was a big concern for the Sculottes, And so by establishing a low price of bread, the Committee of Public Safety satisfied one of the leading demands of the sans-culottes, the people of Paris. However, they also imposed rationing to make sure that bread was shared fairly and also to make sure that the army was fed. The government also nationalized many small workshops, and they also requisitioned, meaning they forcibly took away raw materials and grain from peasants in the countryside. And this actually is kind of similar to some of the techniques we see from communist Russia in the early 20th century, this idea of a planned government-controlled economy with strict rationing. All arms and munitions, that means like other types of weapons, were produced for the war effort. And again, like I said, this is kind of an early form of socialism, extreme government-controlled socialism, specifically to support a war effort. And while the war is going on, the outside war, the civil war, this leads us to the most famous moment in the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror is basically the most notorious event of the revolution. It's not just a single event, it's really a time period that lasted from September of 1793 to July of 1794. And the Reign of Terror was basically a response to the domestic crisis, meaning the counter-revolution, and the purpose of it was to protect France from the enemies of the nation. And what's ironic about the Reign of Terror is that the leaders, men like Robespierre and other revolutionaries, ultimately suppressed by force the very rights that many people desired. So during the Reign of Terror, there was no free speech, there was no free thought, there was definitely no freedom from excessive government power. The French government became what they had sought to get rid of during the Reign of Terror. One of the key elements of the Reign of Terror is something called the Law of Suspects. The Law of Suspects. In the Law of Suspects, alleged enemies of the revolution were brought before these revolutionary tribunals, these special courts that were created to hear cases of treason. And this was actually created as an alternative to what was called the lynch law. But anyways, we have these special courts that are hearing these cases of treason, and dozens, if not hundreds of people would be accused of treason on a daily basis. Like I said, this is really the intense atmosphere of fear and suspicion and paranoia. Anyone who did not appear to be like a fully supportive member of the Republican government, right? Of Robespierre's leadership could be targeted. Anyone could accuse anyone for anything, and basically accusation led to execution. So about 40 to 50,000 people were executed in France during the Reign of Terror, and mostly by the guillotine. So here you can see a diagram of the guillotine, which was actually a new form of execution created for the French Revolution. What's ironic is this was seen as an enlightened form of execution, and also a form of execution that established equality. So what I mean by this is that before the guillotine, executions could be carried out in different manners depending on your social station. So if you were a higher social station, like a noble, you would be beheaded, which was seen as a faster, less painful form of execution. Whereas if you were of the lower class, a peasant or an urban worker, you would likely be hung, which could be more painful, more prolonged, more horrific in a lot of ways, more conscionable. So anyways, the idea here is that the revolutionaries wanted everyone to be equal. Because again, égalité, fraternité, liberté type of thing. And this was also seen as a more humane form of execution. So beheading was seen as, I guess, the preferable way to die, more so than hanging or being shot or whatever. And so people would lie down on this bench, as you can see, and this blade at the very top would be released, come down, chop off their head, and the head would land in the basket. And as you can see, the executioner would often pick up the head and show it to the crowd, which I have a funny story about later. If you will remind me, I will tell it to you in class about the about a doctor who was killed by the guillotine. I don't want to get into it now, but remind me and I'll tell you afterwards during class. Okay, so like I said, this was a way for everyone to be executed equally, so from peasants to the sans-culottes to even the king and queen. So Louis the XVI was executed in this manner. Marie Antoinette was also executed in October of 1793. And like I said, this became a spectator sport for the people of Paris. Although only about 16,000 people were executed in Paris, many more of the executions actually took place in regions outside of Paris, especially places that saw a lot of counter-revolutionary activity. The terror ultimately became a political weapon, almost a personal political weapon of Robespierre. And it was not necessarily directed at any particular group or any particular social class. Everyone was fair game. Nobles, bourgeoisie, clergy, even peasants and members of the laboring classes in Paris, member of the sans-culottes. And even beyond the thousands and thousands of executions, over 300,000 people were imprisoned during the reign of terror. This included the Dauphin, meaning the son of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. The revolutionaries didn't go so far as having a child executed, but they imprisoned him and sort of let him conveniently get sick and starve to death in prison, which is pretty horrible too. Eventually, no one was able to feel safe from Robespierre's reign of terror, as Robespierre used this as a way to target his political opponents. He targeted the Girondins, like I said. He targeted anyone who opposed him. He even eventually targeted Georges Danton. So, this seems pretty shocking. Let me explain. So, Georges Danton and Robespierre had begun to grow apart during the Reign of Terror. And Danton particularly disapproved of how Robespierre suppressed dissent. Danton recognized that they were essentially violating the rights and privileges that they wanted to achieve for the French people, that they were becoming this hypocritical, tyrannical authority. But Robespierre was so consumed with his own power that anyone who doubted him became his enemy, because Robespierre did not want to lose his power. And so he and Danton sort of have a falling out. Danton actually became the leader of the Girondins, right, the moderate opposition. And so Robespierre orders the arrest and execution of Danton and his followers. So Danton was actually executed on Robespierre's orders in April of 1794. And supposedly, one of the last things Danton said is, "My only regret is that I am going before that rat Robespierre," which gives you an indication of things to come. Robespierre intended through all of this to create what he called a republic of virtue. All right, so this is essentially this new political culture under Robespierre designed to create revolutionary virtue, whatever that means, right? He wanted to create this culture of revolutionary virtue. And he's going to do some pretty crazy stuff to create this republic of virtue, like creating a new religion. So in June of 1794, Robespierre establishes the cult of the Supreme Being. This was, in essence, a new religion introduced to help the de-Christianization of France, to help eliminate eliminate Christian influence in France. It was really more of a deist religion, based in deism, this idea of more sort of an agnostic view of the world, in which the republic declared to recognize the existence of God and the immortality of the soul. But it did not create the same type of worship and culture surrounding, Christian, like we see in Christianity. So, for example, it's like, okay, we acknowledge the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, but otherwise, we don't want anything to do with Christianity. Specifically, Notre Dame Cathedral was converted and renamed into the Temple of Reason. Streets and other buildings would be renamed. So, like if the street was named St. Louis, the Saint part of the name would be removed. They also eliminated Sunday worship services, so they closed all the churches. They also got rid of public crosses and public displays of religion. Robespierre actually created new types of ceremonies and had sort of this new ceremony in Notre Dame, the Temple of Reason, where he kind of emerged as this leader of the new religion, dressed in these fancy robes. And it's like, wait, is this a cult? Like, what's going on? Who does Robespierre think he is? Like, he's already become this tyrannical political figure, and now he's becoming a godlike figure. And this is where people are really starting to question his leadership and probably his sanity as well. And of course, the whole cult of the supreme being movement created further resentment against Robespierre and his revolutionary leadership, because despite all of this, despite everything that has happened, France is still very, very strongly Catholic. In addition, the other crazy thing that Robespierre does is he introduces a new revolutionary calendar. So basically, he's going to get rid of the old traditional calendar because it was like based too much on, Christianity and reason and logic, I guess. But he created a new revolutionary calendar, and basically the whole state was expected to follow this new calendar. This new calendar started with the birth of the revolution. So like September 22nd, 1792, the day the French Republic was proclaimed, that is like year one, day one on the calendar. And they basically restructured the way we tell time. Yes, they kept 12 months, but each month was made up of 3 10-day weeks, which actually created fewer non-working days in an effort to increase productivity. So that would be awful, fewer weekends. Can you imagine that? Also, each month had a new name. They wanted to get rid of the old names because, again, that was too reminiscent of the old regime. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of opposition to this new calendar. It's not easy to write a new calendar and change the way people tell time. And eventually, this new calendar system would be disbanded after the Reign of Terror. All right, so these two events, the cult of the supreme being and the revolutionary calendar, really enhanced the sort of public opposition, widespread public opposition to Robespierre and the revolutionary leaderships. Catholics in particular were now firmly against the National Convention, and the counter-revolutionary movement, as we will see, will soon prevail in some ways. So that brings me to the end of the Terror. So in July of 1974, basically is the end of the Terror because it is the end of Robespierre. As I said, with all these crazy developments, there was mounting opposition to Robespierre, who was acting, again, like this tyrannical, king-like, god-like figure who was totally infallible. Well, on July 27th, 1794, Robespierre comes before the National Convention with his usual stump speech, basically, getting up saying, I have a list of names of the enemies of the revolution. We need to commit to the Reign of Terror. We need to root out the enemies. We have to fight this war. And at this point, the National Convention had decided this was their moment in which they were going to turn against him. And men started to rise up to shout over him. Robespierre was denounced in the convention. And ultimately, he and his followers were arrested and they were executed the next day. popular opinion finally had turned against Robespierre. And Robespierre had created this power for himself because he was so paranoid that someone was going to turn against him and have him killed, that ultimately he got himself killed in doing this. This is one of the great ironies of the French Revolution, that it becomes sort of perverted and hypocritical in the creation of this, violent, tyrannical reign of terror. But after really the death of Danton had also been a major turning point. Many people in the National Convention realized that if Robespierre was willing to kill Danton, he was willing to kill anyone. Also, the Sculottes of Paris also began to grow weary of the violence, and members of the Sculottes had also been targeted. So they realized, there really wasn't a clear method to this madness. Anyone could be targeted. But still, the death of Robespierre is really a major turning point, because the death of Robespierre brings an end to the radical phase of the revolution, and ultimately brings an end to the reign of terror as well.